users are starting to store stuff in OneDrive, but if they search on the OneDrive side, they only see stuff that's been stored in OneDrive. And if they search on-prem, they only see information that's on-prem. We want both. We want them to be able to search on-prem and see stuff that's in OneDrive, and we want them to be able to search from OneDrive and see stuff that's on-prem. All right. So how do we start passing information back and forth? All right. And this is comes down to implementing a hybrid search scenario. All right. So your hybrid search is typically part of a broader search strategy. This particular customer wasn't just trying to search information in Office 365. They were also searching file shares. They were also searching other external applications. It's not a scenario that I would recommend if you're only trying to enable SharePoint search. All right. But if you've got a larger search strategy, then this is typically pretty good. Another scenario that we had was a customer moved entirely to Office 365. All right, they wanted all of their SharePoint stuff in 365, but they had file shares on-prem that they also wanted to make available for search. All right, so what we did was we set up a small SharePoint server on-prem, okay, that could index those files, and then we federated search with Office 365 so that they could search all of their file shares from one interface. So there's three scenarios for hybrid search. You have hybrid search in a one-way outbound scenario, okay? And that means that when you're on-prem and you're searching, all right, the SharePoint server can query SharePoint online, but when you're external and doing a search, it doesn't query anything internally, okay? And this is useful for scenarios where, let's say you're using SharePoint Online as your extranet. You've set up some sites there so that you can invite external users to collaborate with their Windows Live IDs. All right, it's kind of a cheap and dirty, quick and dirty extranet scenario. But you don't want people who are on that extranet, all right, to necessarily have access or search results for internal environments. Okay. So in this scenario, we're actually going to step through the scenarios first, and then we're going to talk about the configuration. All right. The second scenario is OneWay Inbound. Okay. In this scenario, your SharePoint Online users can query the internal SharePoint environment. Okay, but the internal and SharePoint environment doesn't submit any queries to the SharePoint Online environment. Okay. Honestly, this is a choice, but I'm not sure 100% why you would do this. Anybody think of any reasons why you would have somebody query your internal SharePoint environment but not be able to get results from your external environment or your Office 365 environment?
An enterprise search that was just pulling information from multiple sources. You didn't really want them to actually be able to see what was up in the cloud.
All right, fair enough. Single source, okay, that's a good one. Any other ideas? No? All right. Teach me something. All right, so one-way inbound, one-way outbound. To do two, all right, to do inbound and outbound, it's just a matter of mixing those solutions together, okay? You just set up the configuration for one-way outbound and you set up the configuration for one-way inbound, okay? So let's take a look real quick at how this would get set up. All right, I want to do that by kind of just going through this this diagram here with you, okay, to talk about some of the different steps that you would take. Now, one thing I don't have on this diagram is the identity management components that we talked about just a minute ago. All right, this is just for the two-way hybrid search. All right, so you're going to need a couple of pieces of hardware. All right, and that's going to function as a reverse proxy in your perimeter network or in your DMZ. All right, these are going to be load balanced reverse proxy servers. This can be the web application proxy role in SharePoint or in Windows Server 2012. Once you set up your reverse proxy is going to have two network cards. It's going to have a network card that is connecting it to or giving it a route to the internal network and a route to the public network. All right. You're going to take your internal SharePoint environment. Okay. You're going to dedicate a single web application as the primary web application. Okay. This primary web application is going to have to support NTLM, unfortunately. So most times what we see is people dedicate a single web application just to the primary hybrid role. All right, they're not using one of their existing web applications. All right, so this primary web application is going to have a single site collection. All right, and that single site collection is what you're going to configure as the connecting piece into SharePoint Online. On SharePoint Online, all right, so externally, you're going to configure a couple of DNS entries, all right, for your primary web application. It's going to have an external URL. And this external URL is going to resolve to the public port of your reverse proxy. Okay. You're going to have an internal URL, all right, which is going to be set up in central administration, all right, that is going to just resolve inside the network. And you're going to have a bridging URL, all right. The bridging URL is going to actually be what communicates between the proxy and the internal primary web application. All right. So when your request comes in, all right, it's actually going to hit this sphybrid.company.com, which is going to then use the bridging URL to hit SharePoint. SharePoint's going to render the content, send it back out the bridging URL, and then back out the reverse proxy. Okay. So there's a couple of different components to this that also have to be taken into consideration. You're going to need a couple of certificates or one certificate with multiple subject names. All right. Your subject names are going to include your internal SharePoint URL, the public SharePoint URL, the bridging URL if you're including that in using SSL. It's going to have your and then you're going to be putting your certificates into a couple of different places. All right, you're going to replace the secure token, the secure certificate in the secure store service. You're going to create a user ID for the secure store service, and it's going to be the user that is actually submitting queries. Okay, and the queries are going to index over here and come back. Okay. Sorry, I'm lost here for a second. I apologize, guys. We'll jump back to that in a second here. Let's instead talk about what this looks like once it's configured. Okay. This is a federated search result. All right. So your search results are not in line with each other. All right, or mixed together. You get two different search result panels. All right. One for your internal environment, one for your external environment. Okay. Now, a few notes on the certificates. All right, you get a UCC cert with multiple subject names that's used for your identity management solution, or can be used for your identity management solution, your STS services, your internal web application, your external web application, and your bridging URL. Okay. A couple of things about the primary web application that's used to bridge that connection. All right, it has to be set up with NTLM authentication. All right, so we recommend that the web application is dedicated for the purpose. Regardless of how many internal web applications you have or how many hybrid scenarios you plan to deploy, you still only need that one web application. Okay. The primary web application can support hostname site collections or path-based site collections. If a path-based site collections are used, you've either got to use split DNS, or that's when that bridging URL scenario comes into play. All right. So this is just a more explanation about the bridging URL for that primary web application. all right, your reverse proxy is configured to push information from this URL out through the bridging URL. The SharePoint site is set up to accept requests from the bridging URL, all right, and return requests back via the bridging URL, all right. Then you have your internal URL for your SharePoint application, and then it also supports the default URL as being the external URL, all right. And the reason your default URL is the external address is so that when people make requests against that address, all right, your SharePoint knows that the default URL is the URL that you return for certain application pages, for workflows, for email alerts, things like that.
So does everyone who's doing this have to have an Office 365 account, or
Everyone who's doing
the queries going from outside? Does everyone have to have an Office 365? We have an environment where some people have Office 365 accounts and some don't.
Okay.
Is there a restriction that people would have to have an outside account?
So what you're going to do is you're going to set up your search center, right? And your search center is going to have a results set that includes the federated results from your SharePoint Online, right? And when someone internally executes a query, all right, it's going to try and execute that query on the other side. But that user, if they don't have an Office 365 account, they're not going to have permissions to any of the content on Office 365. So they're not going to see any results, okay? The query will still get submitted if that's how your search center is configured, right? But they won't see anything because it's still going to be permissions trimmed. So if they don't have an account over there, they don't have permissions to any documents over there, they're not going to see any results over there.
So if you're trying to create a seamless environment so people don't need to know where they are, can you still do that? I mean, I understand they wouldn't be able to see stuff on Office 365, but would they, can we set up one seamless environment for where they would do the queries or not?
Yeah, I mean, you can set up a single search center, all right, and execute all queries from there, all right, and yeah, I mean, the users that don't have permissions on the online side just won't see results from the online side. They'll only see results from what they have access to. Now, what do you mean by seamless environment?
That's exactly it. One search center.
One
so
search
that they don't
center.
need to know that, okay, if you have an Office 365 account, go here. If you have a regular account, go here. You don't need to do that. You can have one search center.
Yes, okay, absolutely, absolutely. Now kind of a tricky bit about the word seamless environment, okay, because that doesn't really exist. So your users who have permissions in both places, okay, they're still going to use one search center. They're still going to execute their query from one place. But when the results come back, it's going to be from two different places. All right? So they're going to have to exercise some judgment as far as, hey, if I click this link, it's going to take me to SharePoint Online, whereas if I click this link, it's going to be internal. Okay?
Right. But they don't really have to care, right?
They don't necessarily have to carry, especially if single sign-on is enabled, all right, and they are seamlessly then transferred into the SharePoint Online environment. So a couple of notes on the reverse proxy. As I mentioned, it sits in the perimeter network. Typical configuration has two network adapters, all right, so that you can kind of pass information between the public network and the internal network, all right. You configure it so that only the internal network can resolve DNS and only the external network contains a gateway address, all right. And then you kind of create persistent routes on that proxy between the two environments so that you're not able to go anywhere else internally. All right. The external adapter is bound to a public address, either by network address translation or some other means. And the web application's external URL should resolve in the public DNS. So in GoDaddy or VeriSign, something like that, you're going to have to create an external record. All right, so a couple of things that you don't get with this scenario, all right? The search experience isn't that great, in my opinion, okay? Because I would like to see seamless results. I'd like to see it rank results based on relevance and not necessarily separate them based on environment, okay? Now there's some tweaking that you can do with that, but it's not out of box, right? You don't get any kind of global navigation. You don't get any kind of like, site directory that shows you where your online sites are and where your on-prem sites are. You don't get any kind of synchronization of the branding, application settings, taxonomy, manage metadata, content types. These are still two separate environments, all right? All we're getting is search queries being passed back and forth, okay? You don't get any kind of integration or link up between your social or news feeds. So, questions on hybrid search?